Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I hope and pray everyone is doing well. This is just a quick behind the scenes for my upcoming article on guidelines to deal with a hadith that may seem problematic at first blush. The issue of hadith that seem difficult to square with one's worldview is something that is commonplace. You will often come across people who very easily dismiss hadith, saying that it's something I can't understand, hence there's no reason for me to accept it. Just the other day I was out with a friend, we went for lunch, and randomly this elderly gentleman, a local community member, he comes and he says, oh, by the way, I had a question. Hadith, you know what, Allah tells us to apply our reason, and this hadith, he was talking about a particular hadith, it tells me to do something that is unreasonable. So it's very common, you'll find people talk about it all the time. The issue is, what can I do as a Muslim who is concerned with my faith when I read certain hadith that I find difficult to square with my worldview or seem problematic in terms of its content or seems to conflict with other hadith? So that's kind of the purpose of this article. In it, I address several things. First, I go into a basic historical overview of some classical attempts to deal with the same phenomenon. I mean, look, it's really obvious that we're not the first people to find issue with certain problematic things that may be found in the hadith literature, because people in the past may have found those same things at first blush apparently problematic, and they've dealt with it. So I talk about someone like Imam Shafi'i, Ibn Qutayba, Al-Tahawi, and others who basically began a genre of hadith literature where they tackle hadith that are either conflicting with one another or seem to be problematic or conflict with external realities. Then I offer some preliminary considerations in terms of, okay, if a hadith comes to me, I shouldn't be so quick to judge it on face value, because I would need to gather all of its various routes. A scholar of hadith from the 3rd century, his name is Ali ibn al-Madini, he says that until you don't gather all the routes of a hadith, you won't fully understand the possible defects in it, right? So I'm reading a hadith thinking that it's really problematic and it's troubling me, not realizing that the version of the hadith that's before me may not be the authentic version. And I give an example of that in the article. And then I talk about some classical methods of reconciling differences, albeit it was more used in a legal sphere. Its application is more universal about, can we reconcile? Should we seek out abrogation? Should we try to prefer one hadith over the other in the case of conflict? Then we get to the main body of the hadith, where I just lay down some basic principles that I personally keep in mind when I deal with a hadith of this nature. So I begin by talking about the limitations of human reason, right? Like, to go back to that gentleman who kind of came to me and said, oh, look, this hadith is saying this happened in the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and I find it unreasonable. The first thing is, look, something being irrational is very different from it being super rational, right? So there can be things that the Prophet ﷺ speaks about in the hadith that are beyond the limitations of the human intellect or human experience. So when it talks about something, say for instance, shaitan, the devil, upon hearing the adhan, passes wind and runs away. Now I can scoff at that and say, oh, it's hilarious, it's absurd, it doesn't make any sense. Well, the question is, on what grounds are you criticizing it, right? Because it's talking about something that's beyond the scope and limitations of your intellect, your physical experience. Is talking about something related to the unseen. Then I get into the use of figurative speech. This is very common, right? There are many hadith which, if understood literally, could be problematic, right? There's the hadith about whether the sun prostrates before the throne of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and other ahadith of this nature. By taking it too literally, we may not fully understand what it is, or the broader message that the Prophet ﷺ is trying to impart to us. Another consideration is just not being anachronistic, right? We don't want to impose our own worldview upon the Messenger of Allah ﷺ and the world that he was living in. So when he would say something about marriage, when he would say something related to ethics or related to behavior, we can't now say that, wait, that's absurd, because why? In my time, in my day, I find it problematic. No, we have to be understanding of the fact that people lived in different times and they had different considerations. And also the need to distinguish between something being impossible versus something being unlikely. Something can be something can be unlikely to me today, but it can be absolutely likely in the future, or it can be understood better by somebody else. But for me to dismiss it as something impossible is unfair. There are other things that I discuss in the article. By no means is it meant to be exhaustive. It's just a few basic considerations that I keep in mind when I deal with a hadith that at first blush may seem difficult for me to accept or seem to conflict with my worldview. I do hope that these guidelines would be helpful to everyone, just like they have been helpful to me. Again, it's a very broad topic that requires much more expertise, requires much more research, and hopefully further research and papers will be provided on the subject. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to see the truth as truth and see falsehood as falsehood, and may He direct us towards guidance and truth. Jazakumullah khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.